Common Good Podcast. It's Wednesday, January 12th, which means that on Wednesdays we talk about faith. And we're launching into a whole season of asking people of faith how their faith drives them to the common good. What is it that pushes them, compels them, calls them, leads them, sends them, whatever phrase best represents their life in the common good. And I am so excited to have Or Rose here today. Or is a friend and rabbi and the director of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership at Hebrew College outside of Boston. And we're really excited, Or, to talk to you. You have been a really good friend to the interreligious work. You've been a very good friend to creative and emerging pastors and Christian leaders in an amazing way for a long time. I don't know how long we've known each other, a decade and a half, maybe. I don't know. It just feels like I don't remember the period before I knew Or Rose. So it's been a long time. And thank you for all your friendship, for all your good work, and for being willing to talk today.
Thank you so much, Doug. Right back at you. You are an inspiration.
That's nice of you. Thank you. Hey, okay, Or let's jump right into it. First of all, for people who don't always pay a lot of attention, can you just talk about what a rabbi is and what a rabbi does? You know, in all of our traditions, we have different roles for teachers, leaders, pastors, ministers, rabbis, clericals, all this kind of stuff. Can you just talk about, for you, in your tradition, when somebody says you're a rabbi or talks about you as a rabbi, what does that mean for you? How does that land for you?
Thank you for that generous question. As you might guess, like in Christianity, being a rabbi today can mean many things. So let me try and answer it as you posed it in terms of what it means to me. As I reflect back on the work that I've done over the last 20 years and the work that I hope to continue to do, I see myself as a teacher and interpreter of the Jewish tradition, which means that I feel like we have been bequeathed this great treasure chest of resources from the past, and we have a responsibility in the present to interpret it in light of the needs of the day. And so one way to think about that is that we are always both inheritors and innovators. So as a teacher, that certainly is operative in my work at Hebrew College and work with other seminarians and with people at various stages along their spiritual and ethical journeys. Related to that is that for me, writing in various forms, like for you, is an important outlet to try and better understand myself, my relationship to the divine, to other people, to the world. And that includes both popular and scholarly writing. Yeah. And then the third piece is activism and organizing, and trying to do that with passion and humility, which is another of those tensions which we have to hold carefully.
And in your case, your work, your rabbinic work, is not so much in a congregation. You're not working at a temple. You're right. Working in academia and in public spaces and in those kind of spaces. Is that different? Is that for you as a faith leader that's not rooted in your leadership in responsibilities at a congregation? Does that I don't know, do something different to you in your faith and your thoughts about your own life and work?
So I feel very blessed because my full-time work has been at Hebrew College over the last 20 years approximately. And in that context, I've been given the opportunity to grow and evolve in different ways. So there have been times when I've been more involved with the Rabbinical School of Hebrew College and other graduate programs at Hebrew College, times where I've been more focused on academic work and or formal classroom teaching, times when I've been involved in informal or co-curricular work. And as you well know, much of my work, too, has been interreligious and cross-cultural. But I should say that for the last 20 years, I've also been a part-time pulpit rabbi, that is a visiting rabbi for a small congregation in the Hudson Valley in New York. And that has added tremendously to my life and to my understanding of what it means to be a religious leader. And I want to say one more word about that. This community is mostly constituted by older adults, people that moved from New York or Boston and wanted to live in a more rural area as they approached retirement, or folks that divide their time between cities and the country. And when I began that work, I was 27 or 28 years old,
Wow.
very newly minted, and did not think that I'd be working with older adults. And our popular culture too often tells us that that is not hip or fill in the blank.
Yeah.
But I've learned so much from this community of wise elders, people that have walked, have trudged, are limping, are celebrating, are teachers, are mentors, are folks that are now harvesting lifetimes of experience. And I've been the beneficiary of it as much as I've given to them.
That I'd like to ask you a little bit about that, and really about Jewish life in America and in the modern day world where we find ourselves. One of the things that I have learned, especially from more from my rabbi friends or people whose Jewish identity is really also their faith and not only a cultural space. Mm-hmm. They carry a lot of weight. There's a lot of heaviness and worry about Jewish life and life as a whole. And, sometimes like in popular culture, you get this stuff about like, well, you get all those worrying Jewish grandmothers that are just worried about you all the time. So there's kind of a punchline narrative to it. But boy, when I talk to my friends who take this stuff seriously, I think there's something embedded in the Jewish narrative and the Jewish story in the United States in the early 21st century that's different. Can you just talk a bit about that, or am I onto something? Do you all talk about that? How do you think about that?
Right. So the first thing to say is that we all need to avoid stereotypes, and the casual or the more serious othering of groups, and the story of the Jewish people over centuries has involved tremendous suffering, trauma, and dislocation. And that is a trauma that is carried intergenerationally. And in this day and age, of course, there has been a demonstrable resurgence of anti-Semitism in this country. And that is worrisome, and that requires action. It requires action on behalf of the Jewish community, and as a leader in the Jewish community, I take that very seriously. But it also requires work across communities, and we need allyship. Just as other groups, particularly those that are minority and or marginalized, need allyship. And you and the folks at Common Good have exemplified that, as you said in the introduction, in my experience, for at least a decade and a half or two in our relationship, even though we're both still young and spry.
That's right. We're not done yet.
I want to add a couple of other comments. It's important to remember that the Jewish people are a tiny minority globally, right? And that is connected to some stereotypes about Jews and power, Jews and wealth, Jews and media. And those tropes have been played with and used for dangerous ends in the last several years yet again. But we're a very small minority. And so I think there is reason to be concerned about our continuity. But in addition to continuity, our vibrancy, right? How do we create a Judaism that is compelling so that our distinctive ways of being, of believing, of practicing will continue if we love them and think that they are of value? And we're not alone in asking that question. In fact, you and I, from different backgrounds and different perspectives have been asking questions about the vibrancy and the relevancy
Yeah.
of religious life, Jewish, Christian, and otherwise in the United States for a long time. But I think those are real concerns, and I think it's also important to remember that as at home as Jews often feel in the United States, perhaps like no other situation in our history, when there are these flare-ups, including violence against
Mm-hmm.
Jews and Jewish institutions, um, it it vibrates
Yeah.
within and across our community.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so true. When we ask this question, how does your life, your faith drive you to the common good? Sometimes people like to put on the other side of sort of the common good your own tribal identity. And this is a word that gets used in kind of common parlance in a way that lands differently for indigenous communities. They think about tribal identity really differently, right? They don't mean it as a negative. And even in Jewish community, and sometimes there are people who think that if you're going to worry about your own group and how the people like you are getting along in the world, that keeps you from caring about the common good, or that prevents you from thinking about the everyone. And one of the gifts that I have found from people in the Jewish community, especially faith leaders in the Jewish community, is the absolute call that both of those things matter and one will not be pitted against the other. And I think that's a particular gift that Jewish leaders have, is trying to say, as you say, to a small group, less than 1% of the American population that is constantly under threat and attack. I just think about what Jeff Farmer said in the comments here. He says the problem is that Nazis of yesteryear are in the United States now, and they're also there on a global scale. And so there's this struggle that's going on about how do you protect your own community and identity and also care about the whole. That doing both of those things is something you're actually called to. Your faith communities try to propagate this. The teachings of the faith call for this, and I think a lot of other people could benefit from it. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the role of caring for your own community and simultaneously, or maybe as a means, caring about the whole?
Right. So I strongly believe that we, again, need to hold attention. That's a refrain that I often use. In this case of particularity and universality. We are both similar and we are different. And when we forget one or the other of those, it becomes dangerous. One of my models in this regard is the late, great Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the 20th century's great theologians and social activists. And he was once asked by a reporter shortly before his death, do you think that religious diversity is a problem because there are so many arguments and there's been so much bloodshed in the name of God and religious truth over the centuries? And Heschel paused and said, let me ask you a question. And he was, of course, using an old rabbinic tactic, answering a question with a question. And he said to the reporter, how would you feel if you walked into the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all of the pictures were exactly the same?
Wow.
And that was his response to the reality, which needs to be addressed and combated, of extreme tribalism, chauvinism, etc. But we also don't want to live in a world that is homogenous. That would be tyrannical. And we have seen attempts by individuals and regimes to try and create homogenous societies.
Yeah.
And that too is dangerous. So how do we cultivate the virtues of universality and particularity and hold that tension? I want to say too that for me, Heschel, among others, is a a beautiful example of a person that experienced great trauma. He described himself as a brand plucked from the fire because he escaped, the horrors of Nazism by 6 weeks. He came to the United States. And one could have certainly understood if a person like Heschel, given that experience, decided to live a quiet, more insular life within Jewish academia and Jewish religious community. But out of his experiences of pain, of dislocation, of loss, he decided to enter the fray and to say, my experience leads me to want to act with and on behalf of others. And of course, he was inspired in that effort by, among other sources, the prophetic teachings of the Hebrew Bible. And most elementally, I would say, for a person like Heschel and for many others, myself included, the teaching that every human being is created in the divine image, imago Dei, as it's expressed in classical Christian sources,
Yeah, right.
requires us to be caring, considerate of people near and far. And that is a religious obligation as far as I understand it. And so you might say that, God covenants with Noah, and it's a global covenant, right, after the great flood story. And then God covenants with the people of Israel at Sinai. And those are two covenants, and one is universal and the other is particular. And I think that symbolically, those are teachings that guide me, along with that earlier teaching from Genesis that each and every one of us is endowed with spiritual worth and value before we do or say anything. We are born as holy beings. It does not mean that we can't do wrong. We do wrong every day in a variety of ways. And there are consequences to negative actions and such. But we also have to remember that the people that we love, the people that we like, the people that we dislike, the people that infuriate us, were also created in God's image.
Hey, can we do a little Bible lesson here on some of this? Because I'd really love your opinion about this. There's a lot of Christians who narrate a story, especially evangelicals, and a lot of former evangelicals, or people like to refer to themselves as ex-evangelicals, are trying to reconcile their life around all of this. That the story goes for a lot of people, the Old Testament, which you'd call the Bible, so the Old Testament is the mean God, the bad cop. And then the New Testament is the good cop, the loving God. And you sort of hold both of those. And aren't we thankful that Jesus came to appease the wrath of the angry God that we read about in the Old Testament? And aren't we glad we're not just left with only that other story, and so on? So this is what's often told, right? And a lot of Christians especially who want to lean themselves into the teachings of Jesus, sometimes want to avoid all of the First Testament's narratives and so on. But this idea of the Old Testament has this bad God narrative, the New Testament has the loved by God, love one another, that call, that thing continues to just wreak havoc. And when I have a chance to talk to a rabbi like you or others who hold their Jewish faith so closely, you don't narrate the Bible that way, right? You don't have a narrative of you got a judgmental, angry, mean God. Can you just talk a bit about that?
Sure. So let me start by sharing, what I consider a basic kind of methodological premise. And I don't expect that everyone shares this perspective, but I am a faithful reader of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Tanakh, and it plays a central role in my life. And at the same time, I'm also a student of the historical critical study of that source and other sacred sources. And so, to me, it is clear that the Hebrew Bible and most other sacred sources across our traditions, but let me focus on my tradition,
Yeah.
are the patchwork, the beautiful kind of quilting of God seekers, of people that were trying to create lives of meaning and holiness. And they were edited and redacted and shared over centuries. And so within the Tanakh, you have a variety of voices. There isn't one voice.
Nice.
And one could be a more traditional reader of that text and see that very clearly. But I'm just being transparent in my own approach because to me, it feels both intellectually honest
Right.
and it's spiritually liberating because I can say that I look back on all of these writings on God, on community, on holiness, on the other, and some of them resonate immediately with me. Some of them feel foreign to me. Some of them have taken me time, and I've tried hard to understand the worldviews, the perspectives, the experiences of people seeking and challenged and such, and others I disagree with. And I don't hold up as the kind of spiritual and moral teachings that I would advocate for here and now. I'm aided in this process because Judaism is a robust interpretive tradition.
Yeah, that's important. I want you to say more about that in a minute. That bit's important.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I want to say, of course, is that Jesus was a very skillful interpreter of the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
And you see the ways in which he partakes of that rabbinic culture of interpretation in very creative and beautiful ways. And you see the same thing in rabbinic texts from that same period in the Talmud and then in the Midrash and throughout Jewish history. So anytime I sit down and I read the Hebrew Bible, I'm reading Genesis or Deuteronomy or Isaiah or Amos, but more often than not, I'm also reading the commentaries of people from the 2nd century, the 7th century, the 13th century, the 18th century, and the 20th century. And blessedly, in more recent times, it's not only men, but women and people who identify otherwise that are part of this ongoing process of reading, studying, interpreting, and making Torah alive. So Torah, as one of my teachers, Arthur Green, often says, is that Torah is both a product, but more importantly, a process. And we are a part of a great chain of interpretive tradition. And we are called to continue to interpret. Right? I think it is akin to, some, Christian billboards and signs that I see, God still speaks.
Yeah.
For us, one of those means is through this interpretive process of being involved with seekers across the ages and trying to discern what you might describe, going back to the narrative of Elijah, of the still small voice, of the divine. So I hope that's helpful.
It is. I remember first discovering the notion of Jewish midrash, probably in the late 1990s, which was very freeing for someone of my background who wanted a more robust conversation with the scripture, that I wanted to see our scriptures as a member of our community that had to negotiate itself as a full community member, making its claims on the world, and we get to also make our claims, and that we're in this living dynamic space. I guess it's this Jewish notion that the scriptures are living and active, and they're moving, and such a different approach than people who would, take a more static version of scriptures and all. But most religious people that I know don't have the skills that Jewish rabbis tend to have to allow that, as you say, that process of conversation, or to recognize that, you're reading the Hebrew Bible, there's a debate between the prophets and the priests, and they're both laying claim on the Jewish community. And so the prophets say, these priests, they want sacrifices, and they're in a sacrifice narrative. But what does the Lord require of you, says Micah? Not sacrifice, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly. So let's live in that way. And then Jesus comes in the prophetic tradition and is calling out for another way, and is in conflict or discussion, midrashic claims with the priests of the day. So you find yourself in this living story, which I don't know, or I just... I'm not trying to convert to Judaism here, but boy, that part is something I really would love to feel more a part of. And it seems like even in our social spaces, political spaces, religious spaces, that approach as an alternative to didactic fundamentalism, to a fundamentalism that just says there is a way and you're either with it or without it. And boy, there's a lot of us in the social justice spaces that... I've been listening to the president for the last couple of speeches, and I'm very glad that he's being very clear about what happened on January 6th. I'm very glad that he's being clear about voting rights and, which side are you going to be on and all this. But it also just pushes my buttons a little bit. Like, hey, I get nervous around this notion that, there's a this and a that, and you better pick this and not that, because if you pick that and not this, then trouble is coming. And I don't know, that piece, that also sits in the, I think, as you called it, the tension spaces that we find in our faith.
Absolutely. And there are certainly Jewish versions of fundamentalism and extreme dogmatism. One of the texts that folks like me point to over and over again in interviews and in teaching settings is a Talmudic text about the houses of Hillel and Shamai, these two academies that were named after and followed, in the footsteps of their masters, Hillel and Shamai. And according to tradition, Hillel and Shamai and their students disagreed, about virtually everything. And in this particular story, it says that they disagreed about a particular point of religious behavior, of law, for 3 years. And then a voice cries out from the heavens and says, "These and these are both the words of the living God." So the editor of this story then has the chutzpah, thankfully, to ask, okay, that's a beautiful kind of textual proof for the need for theological or epistemological humility. But then why is it that 9 times out of 10, the house of Hillel carries the day when it actually comes to the rulings in community policy? And the narrator answers, because the students of Hillel were kind and modest, and they went so far as to articulate the positions of their interlocutors before their own. And for me, that's nice. A piece of what I call pocket Torah.
Nice.
I carry it with me. I think I learned that expression from another of my teachers, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi. So to me, that story is at once about humility. That is, what we know, what we don't know, and the fact that, religiously speaking, only God possesses ultimate truth. And so we need to carry ourselves with a certain kind of humility when it comes to claims about ultimate truth. At the same time, right, these academies were involved in a debate that really mattered as far as they were concerned. So they didn't simply say, "Oh no, you're right." But they carried on, and they carried on, what the rabbis describe as an argument for the sake of heaven, meaning that they really believed that the rulings that they were trying to institute were significant, that these rulings helped to create a holy community that in the eyes of heaven was sacred. And that too is important, right? It's about universality, it's about particularity, it's about humility. And then, of course, the ending of the story is about how we carry ourselves. So kindness, modesty, and the way that I read that last line in this short text is that, the students of Hillel try to really understand and give voice to the viewpoints of their opponents, as it were. It doesn't mean that they have to agree with them.
Yeah.
And, to put that in contemporary terms, I often say we will find ourselves on opposite sides of the picket lines. And the question then is, how do we view those people across from us? Do we still see that they are created in the divine image? It becomes harder when it comes to issues of voting rights and abortion and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and fill in the blanks. And you have to take action, but we have to do so both with conviction and humility.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very hard. And oftentimes it's painful because I find that my progressive self and my pluralist self, as I've said to you, are sometimes in a tug of war. And then I try and ask myself, do I want to remain in relationship with people that I both agree and disagree with? And at what point are those relationships altered and even severed? And we've all had experiences of that in our families, in our friendship circles, in our working relationships, and it's a struggle. There's no easy way around it if you want to try and live an integrated
that's right.
life.
Yeah, you either choose that struggle or you don't, right? And there's a lot of ways to not choose that struggle. You can choose that struggle by excluding. Right. You can choose that struggle by including, but not struggling. I mean, there's just a lot of work to be done there. All right. Well, we've been referring to Hebrew College here a few times because you're as we said, you're the director of the Miller Center of Interreligious Leadership and Learning at Hebrew College. You say a little bit about Hebrew College? I know a lot of people don't even know that there's things like Hebrew colleges. A lot of the Christians in the world don't really think about how rabbis go to seminary and all the rest. So can you give us a little bit of what Hebrew College is? And then I want to ask you about the big project that you're working on, the Jewish and Christian interpretations of the Book of Psalms. So, but tell us about Hebrew College. I think it's just a beautiful place, fascinating place.
So Hebrew College is actually celebrating its centennial this year. So it's a 100-year-old institution. It was created by Jewish cultural educators and intellectuals. They were not religious, but cultural Jews who had strong ties and commitments to the land of Israel, to the people of Israel, to the Hebrew language, to Hebrew culture. And over the decades that has evolved, so that 20 years ago, we introduced a new rabbinical school, which for the founders of the institution would have been unheard of because they were not setting out to create a seminary or a yeshiva or another religious institution in the United States. They specifically wanted to create a secular cultural institution that was Hebraic in its disposition. But time marches on and different people become involved, and so the founder of the rabbinical school, which is how I became involved with Hebrew College, is my mentor, Arthur Green, whose name I mentioned before, a very fine scholar of Jewish mysticism and a very significant voice in contemporary Jewish theology. And he invited me and one other of his students to help him build this new program, which was conceived by the president of Hebrew College at the time, Rabbi David Gordis, as a non-denominational, or better put, trans-denominational or pluralistic rabbinical school. Because most of the non-Orthodox rabbinical schools identify with the conservative movement, the Reform movement, the Reconstructionist movement, and then within Orthodoxy, there are further identifications and categories. And so we wanted to create this new fangled rabbinical school. in which people that wanted to pursue the rabbinate and the cantorate as prayer leaders could come and study and intentionally be in a diverse context,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that they were learning and praying and exploring and eating lunch with people that practiced and believed differently from them. And we think to this day, 20 years later, that that can be very powerful for people that continue to identify as being independent of denominational categorization, but also to those that want to work in a particular denominational setting, because when you are called on to share with people why you do what you do,
Mm-hmm.
whether intra-Jewishly or interreligiously, um, I think that it can lead to further introspection into a kind of spiritual refinement. Why is it that I celebrate Shabbat in the ways that I do? And why does my classmate do so differently? So I would say, too, that one of the great gifts of being at Hebrew College is that out of the soil of that intra-Jewish experiment in pluralism, I've been able to work on a slew of different interreligious initiatives.
Mm.
And one is supportive of the other. As you know, for more than a decade, Hebrew College was located next door to Andover Newton Theological
Yeah,
School.
shared a physical campus almost. Yeah, right, one
Right.
side of the hill and the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, the oldest Christian seminary in the country at the time. And so, in that context, we created this wonderful living laboratory in the spirit, of religious and interreligious
Mm-hmm.
laboratories of the great Reverend Howard Thurman. And if you don't know his name and his work, then Google it immediately. So that was a beautiful experiment, and in that context, we did a variety of different projects on study, activism, service, worship, reflection, and some of that is blessedly involved you and your comrades from
Yeah.
Common Good.
Yeah. We just say a little bit more. I don't think a lot of people know that there's denominational relationships inside of Judaism. If you're, it's true. Just if you're outside of any system, you tend not to know, the complexities inside. And I find it quite fascinating, actually, and helpful. It's been very helpful to me in my Christian identity, because it's easy to believe that the things we struggle with in the Christian tradition are caused because of something inside of our system. There's a pathogen inside that's causing this trouble. But it's actually the same kind of things show up in many different religious traditions and non-religious traditions. Like there's a common human set of forces that create this kind of interfaith struggle. It's easy to somebody to look around if they're inside the Christian tradition and say, I just don't understand the left and right divides, or the justice versus piety groups, or the Presbyterians and Methodists and Baptists and non-denominational and Pentecostals. Like, why all this change? Why all this different? I thought we were all supposed to be and you kind of just get yourself all messed around. But then you find out, well, similar things inside of Judaism, similar things inside of Buddhism and Hinduism, and my humanist friends, my gosh, they know this really well. Like they can slice their humanism really, really thin, separating one group from the other. So I think it's really helpful. Can you just give a little bit of scope of Jewish tradition and Jewish identity as it relates, especially, like in 21st century United States and, educated global situations?
Sure. So, briefly, because I don't want to fall into a lecture, which I have the propensity to do.
You are a faculty at Hebrew College, after all.
Thank you. So I would say that at root, the question about denominational affiliation is related to the question of authority. Authority in terms of the Hebrew Bible, of rabbinic writings, of precedent, and of tradition, and how much weight, people give these things. Do we see ourselves as being farther from Sinai, if you will,
Mm.
both historically and spiritually, and therefore diminished in terms of generations that came before us? Or do we feel like we are more fully empowered, to make decisions here and now? And of course, all of this is impacted by history, by sociology, by politics, etc., which is not different than
Mm.
than other communities. So in the United States at present, there are three major denominations, and then a fourth smaller denomination, and then movements.
Mm. Aha.
So Orthodoxy, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, and then the fourth denomination is Reconstructionist Judaism, and then there is the Jewish Renewal Movement, and then a whole slew of people, um, again, like in Christian circles, that move between those houses of worship,
Mhm.
those organizations, those denominations. Um, and I think that, if one compares Orthodoxy and Reform Judaism, which came into being in modernity in Europe as responses to um, the new possibilities for Jews to engage in modern life. Um, Orthodoxy is more tightly connected to tradition, precedent,
Mm.
traditional theological notions, oftentimes um, of the authority of Torah and of generations of rabbis that preceded us. And the Reform movement um, really takes a very different tack in terms of personal autonomy and what they consider to be enlightened knowledge, and then self-determination. And the conservative movement um, is a movement that came to be as a kind of mediating force between the two.
Mm.
That on the one hand was still very connected to tradition and precedent, but also embraced historical critical study and felt like that Jewish life, including halakha, Jewish law, was unfolding and needed to continue to unfold in every generation. Mordechai Kaplan, who was a great uh, American Jewish thinker, born in Europe but lived much of his life in the United States, created the Reconstructionist movement,
Okay.
beginning of the 20th century. And much of that had to do with his understanding of theology and sociology. And for him personally, and for many in his generation, um, traditional beliefs. He was born into an Orthodox family, um, and, um, and practiced traditionally, but belief in a personal God became untenable for him, and he felt that that was true for many people of his generation. And so he talked about a process of transvaluation, which was a term very much
Yeah.
of his time in the early 20th century, influenced
Right.
by sociologists. Um, and he said, God is the power that makes for salvation. And he was very influenced by process theology.
Hmm.
And then he said, we need to rethink what authority means, because it's not God who is a commander, but God is a process. God is the possibility
Hmm. Hmm.
that makes, for salvation personally and communally. And he was very invested in a kind of modern American democratic vision of Judaism. So he was very influential within this movement that remains quite small, but his influence, has been much larger, like many innovators across space and time.
Hmm.
And the renewal movement, which is founded by my teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, is also a distinctly American phenomenon, in which, he really took from what he considered the best of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, and Hasidism, Eastern European popular
Hmm.
mysticism and piety, and American culture, specifically American counterculture, you know, in the wake of the Second World War, the Holocaust, and then, the emergence of beat and hippie culture, and really felt like in the wake of these other developments that Judaism was very much in need of a kind of spiritual renaissance that included more emphasis on embodied practice, on song and dance and storytelling, and a much more robust involvement with other religious traditions, in this free and open society. So, so at Hebrew College, I think, we have students that span the gamut. Fewer Orthodox students, but some people that are very serious about traditional halacha and observance. Others that really are much more individual and idiosyncratic in their patterns of practice. But what we say to everyone is, if you are serious about the continuity and vibrancy of the Jewish people in relationship to others in the world, and you want to play a leadership role, as I said before, an inheritor and an innovator, which I think is an expression I gleaned from Heschel, then come and join us. And again, we will live in the tension of being similar and different, and we'll learn from each other. And sometimes that's easier, and sometimes that's harder. As you well know, sometimes it's harder to be in diverse intra-religious settings than it is in interreligious settings.
Yeah,
because,
for sure.
Because
Sure.
the surface tensions feel closer. What do you mean you're going to pray the afternoon service in this way, and you're going to omit this or add that? What do you mean, right, that when you speak of kashrut and dietary rules, you're thinking about this concern but not that concern? And oftentimes we're on better behavior people that we more readily identify as being other. And we forget that, we are plural internally before we even say anything or interact with anyone else.
Nice.
And, to your left and to your right can be two Jews, as the expression goes, and three opinions, which goes back to that interpretive impulse, which to me, frankly, is the secret of our survival.
Yeah.
The Dalai Lama very generously in the 1990s invited a group of rabbis and teachers from North America and Israel to come to Dharamsala. It was a beautiful, generous, and very thoughtful and strategic invitation. He said to this group, I want you to teach me the secret of survival, because we are a more recently exiled people, and
Tibetans,
exile.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And and it's chronicled in a book called The Jew and the Lotus by Roger Kamenetz. And it's fascinating to hear the responses from this diverse group of Jews about what made for the possibility of survival and for thriving, in exile and in diaspora, and how that's complicated now, of course, by a return to the land of Israel and the establishment of the state of Israel, and wrestling with power and all of the troubles in that region, and also being very much at home in many ways in the United States. Again, another, Heschelism is The Insecurity of Freedom, is the title of one of his books. What does it mean for a small minority that really worked hard for centuries to maintain its individual identity, surrounded by, and sadly often oppressed by, majority religious cultures, and suddenly we're in the United States, and so much more is available to us, and you can be so many more different things without the checks, both that the Jewish community placed on members and the larger society, and that too is of concern, right? It's a beautiful opportunity, but what will happen if people opt out?
Where do you find yourself, or where do you place yourself, or when someone says, what kind of Jewish leader are you? Where do you say, I'm from this tradition and I lean into this movement? Where does Or Rose put himself?
Thanks for asking the personal question. Some days I say none of the above. Some days I say all of the above. I would say, honestly, that I would identify certainly as being heterodox. That is, I don't follow Jewish law traditionally in a consistent manner. I care very much about tradition, about text, about praxis, about the wisdom of people that came before me. But there are ways in which I and my family pick and choose. I think
Mhm.
everyone picks and chooses, but I think we're fairly
Conscious of it.
open
Yeah.
and conscious of it. There's no one that doesn't pick and choose, even
Yeah.
those that consider themselves in any community to be orthodox with a small o. Um, and I've been influenced, and I've studied, and I've worked in each of those
Mm.
denomination contexts consciously again over the last almost 30 years. I would say I was most heavily influenced by the Jewish renewal movement.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who's popularly known as Reb Zalman, a more informal term that he liked, as you can imagine, being a person
Right.
that
Right.
came of age and
With
you
a
know
hippie beat. Yeah, sure.
um, but he was my parents' teacher, and they were a part of the
Oh,
beginnings, of a Jewish commune of sorts in Canada, which is why I was raised
nice.
in Canada. And that spirit, of the one on the one hand, looking to the past, particularly the mystical and spiritual teachings of the tradition, and then asking, how do we make use of these tools? Reb Zalman talked about them as spiritual technologies,
Mm.
and I also am very moved by his interreligious vision. In fact, I'm working now on writing about it. I'm finally completing my dissertation, and it's on his evolution as an interreligious practitioner and leader, a person that was trained in an ultra orthodox context, who then went out and changed and was changed by his interactions with Protestants and Catholics and Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims, meeting remarkable people like the Reverend Howard Thurman and the great, Catholic monk
Yeah.
Thomas Merton
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and others. And one expression that I think is helpful, just to finish here on this subject, is this notion of permeability, which Reb Zalman
Mm-hmm.
really,
Nice phrase.
in a kind of new age, ecological
Yeah.
way. He said, we are a part of a living, breathing, right, um, organism. That is life. That is the world, with a kind of Gaian sensibility, and we need to be semi-permeable. Is the expression
Nice.
he liked, right? So that each part of the global body needs to do its work, and we can't all be the same, but we need to exchange vital nutrients, and that continues to speak to me in profound ways.
I love it. I love it so much. All right. So you've launched this project that I'm excited about. Thanks for the invitation to be part of it early on. The Jewish and Christian interpretations of the Book of Psalms. If anything is sort of shared between not just traditions, but communities, the Book of Psalms really sort of has a universality to it, right? A lot of people feel connected to the Psalms, maybe because of their structure or just how they've been used or whatnot. And so you have this Jewish and Christian interpretations of the Book of Psalms with this, wonderfully academic subtitle, an interdisciplinary exploration for religious professionals, right? But you're trying to do something there. I mean, all of
Yes.
those words mean something. The Jewish
Yes.
and Christian interpretations of the Book of Psalms. Tell us, just our final minutes here, a bit about this. What
Sure.
do people
Sure.
do with it, and what are you up to?
Well, like people like Doug Pagitt, I have too many balls in the air at once, working on too many projects. But I hope it's driven not by ego, but by a sense of urgency about needs in the world. But I'm sure both. In my case, you are more saintly, that I know. So this project came to life at the beginning of the COVID pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
For several years, I've been co-teaching a course with a Catholic colleague of mine from Boston College named Andrew Davis on the Book of Psalms and its reception in Jewish and Christian traditions. Andrew is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. And we're always looking for opportunities across communities, for points of intersection. Again, not to flatten what we think and feel and believe and practice, but to compare and contrast and see if we can learn from each other. And the book of Psalms may be the book that is actually used in various ways, most by Christians and Jews, liturgically. And we use it similarly and differently. But think about celebrations of birth and of coming of age. Think about death and mourning. Think about Shabbat services and Mass. Think about virtually anything and everything liturgical. And people have cried, have exalted,
Nice.
have, received solace, have screamed out with outrage and despair through the words of the Psalms. And so it seems to me and to others involved in this project like it's such a ripe text, particularly in a time of great difficulty. In these times of pandemic, of social upheaval, of political polarization, this ancient book, this ancient collection of poems and prayers, I think speaks to us quite deeply, vividly. And it's fascinating to me, as you might expect, to see throughout the ages all of the ways in which people have interpreted these texts. And as you might imagine, many of them have very little to do with the original text and context, but nonetheless have become woven into the fabric of our traditions. So I started this as a project with a colleague, Paul Rauschenbusch, from the Interfaith Youth Corps. Paul, as you know, has been very involved in religious media for 20 years, and we called it Psalm Season, and you were a part of it, and you did a beautiful personal reflection on one of the Psalms on, as related to George Floyd. And so now we are creating a website, which will be called Calling Out from the Depths. And we're trying to, harness all of the creative energies of people, artists, musicians, poets, classical sources, contemporary sources, from the rabbis and the church fathers to Bobby McFerrin and Doug Pagitt, and offer curricula and resources for Jewish and Christian religious leaders so they can teach these materials in their houses of worship, in their study groups, and I hope and pray perhaps with a Jewish partner or with a Christian partner, or a variety of people across communities that see value in these texts. And then as part of it, this year we've been offering seminars through Boston College's continuing education program for religious leaders, workshopping these materials and getting feedback from people. So we had a nice cohort, a global cohort in the fall, and we're about to launch in February a second cohort. So if folks are interested, religious leadership broadly defined, come and join us. It's inexpensive, and there are scholarships available. But we would love for you to be a part of this project, and also working on editing a book version of it with Paraclete Press.
Great. Well, Or, it's so good. Thank you for that work, for your generous spirit, for your contribution to the common good in faith, in culture, in academia, intra and interreligious work. It's really great. Obviously, people can find more information about all of that over at HebrewCollege.edu, one of those, or just Google Hebrew College. It's outside of Boston, if you're ever in the area and need to swing by. And we don't have time to get into it now, but you're also a hockey parent, which is a whole other thing, which probably taps more into your Canadian upbringing than anything else. But Or, thank you for being with us today, and for being just so good at all this.
Oh, right back at you again. You inspire me. You help me get up in the morning and put one foot in front of the other. This is often complicated work, and we need friends and fellow travelers. So bless you, Doug.
like the abominable snowman. One foot in front of the other. And you have some text messages coming in that I've been hearing, so I'll let you go jump onto those text messages like all of us, those little reminders. You know, when I hear those little dings, I treat it like one of those meditation apps. It's like, oh, remind yourself to ground your feet, remind yourself to breathe, right? Instead of letting those be notifications just of information, like some little reset of your brain. So thanks for the dingers, too. All right, or we'll talk with you soon.
Take care.
Okay, buddy, and we'll be back with you all tomorrow.
Bye.